Okay. So it looks like we're live here. Looks like everything's connected. So I think we're good to get started. Um, Welcome everyone to the second lecture that we're doing on George Eliot's massive novel, Middlemarch. Though it's a large novel, I wouldn't say it's an arduous one. I don't know if it's because of the nature of what she's describing, which is just, lots of people's relationships, and we have no end of our capacity for gossip. And so it's a lot easier for us to digest that kind of content than it is for heady ideas. But I'm finding that this is a very digestible, very snackable read compared to something like a Dostoevsky, which we've done in the past, or even a Nietzsche, which was not the longest book, but kind of demanding in its own way. You really had to sit and think about things. Eliot has that, but I just find that it's just so easy to just turn, and it's driven by wit, both in the narration and in the conversations themselves. Um, I'm just finding that this is a really enjoyable kind of summer read. I was reading it on the beach up here in northern Michigan. I'm sure many of you have seen like the picture that I posted about me reading the collected works of Hemingway in Charlevoix while he was talking about Charlevoix. And I said that if that post got more than 100 likes, that I would put on a Michigan Substack conference. Well, currently it's at like 225, 250, somewhere in there, and it doesn't seem to be stopping. So if you're in the Michigan area, so the Greater Lakes area, or the Greater Lakes, the Greater Great Lakes area, yeah, I should have a conference put together here in Grand Rapids in a couple of months. So probably not before the end of the year because people got plans, but I'm going to shoot for maybe spring or very, very early summer. But before that happens, if you're, within a couple hours drive from Grand Rapids, Michigan, I'm planning on doing a few meetups ahead of there so that we can kind of talk about what we want at the conference, where we want to hold it, meet and greet with other Substackers that are in the area. I can think of, probably about a dozen other Michiganders that I know in my feed who I never knew in real life, but I've just been introduced to them through their work on Substack. So we have a lot of great talent in this area, and I really want to get us together so we can talk and enjoy things together. But anyway, I should get back to the story a little bit. Well, one more thing. Whether or not you're in Grand Rapids or the Michigan area, let me know where you are. Where do you live? Also, throughout the chat, tell me how you're enjoying Middlemarch, or maybe you're just curious about Middlemarch and you're just stopping on. Let me know if it's a book that you want to read, if it's a book you're in the middle of reading. Is it a book that you've read in the past? Yeah, I'm just going to discuss books 2 and 3 today, or I'm sorry, I'm going to discuss books 3 and 4 today. We already did 1 and 2 last month. So if you want to get caught up or you want to watch this anytime in the future, feel free to dig up the book talk for chapters or books 1 and 2. And you can get caught up on my thoughts. I have a few essays that I've done on those sections and a few more essays that are going to come out as well about how Dorothea is a shadow artist, about how that there's this couple matrix that I've put together that helps me make sense of what's going on with all these different couples and what things they have in common and where they differ. So it helps me compare them and their different journeys. So a quick recap on parts 1 and 2. We were introduced to our main character, Dorothea, and her issue is her question was about who she's going to marry and what is she going to do with her life. So she had the option of going with Sir James Chatham, who is exactly what society would expect of an eligible bachelor. Um, and instead, she did not go for him. She went for the older gentleman, Casaubon, who has no good red blood in him. He's nothing but parentheses and semicolons, and he's been writing abstracts since he was a baby. But Dorothea says that she's very motivated by knowledge. She has a great thirst for knowledge, and she wants to commit herself to that. And she doesn't have the ability in this culture to pursue studies of her own. And so the only way that she can do that is to ride the coattails of an erudite husband who does have access to those learnings and those dead languages. And the guy that she's married is making a key to all mythologies, he calls it. So for someone who wants to get a sense of the whole and who wants to understand everything, he's really kind of, ideal in that regard. I don't think that anyone else would think he's an ideal bachelor, but for a certain kind of person like Dorothea, he's exactly what she says that she's looking for. But as we saw, the honeymoon, she already kind of realized that maybe she was in the wrong marriage. Maybe this is not, maybe getting everything you ask for is not what you actually want. He's very distant. He doesn't know how to relate to her. They're on their honeymoon and he pretty much leaves her alone to look at art. And meanwhile, his cousin, Will Ladislaw, is there with his German buddy painting. And Will and Dorothea are much more paired, I would say, because she has an idealism that doesn't know how to deal with reality very well. And Fred kind of mediates this because he's a romantic. And romanticism is a kind of idealism, but it's oriented towards the world. And it has a grounding kind of trajectory. That is something that she's lacking. Again, it's not something she wanted. She wanted to have a bookish life with Casaubon because that's all she thought she could expect. But Will has served as a bit of a revelation to her. And of course, we are looking at this as he's much more of a fitting person for her. Similar age, he's handsome and she's beautiful enough that his romantic painter buddy was just marveling at her as the greatest, like Madonna Pieta, and wanted to paint her. So we have this tension that was set up before. We also met some other couples, and I laid them out kind of in my couple matrix, where we have Lydgate, the doctor who's coming and he's very scientifically minded and he just wants to advance medicine in this small village. And then you have Rosamond, who is really beautiful. She's really graceful. She's well schooled in piano and singing and all of these things that make a pleasant woman that society wants at that time. And so they are kind of set up as people that are going to kind of come together, most likely. We can see a budding romance between them. And then finally, we see that, all right, there's two more. So the major one that I'll say for right now is there's Fred and Mary, who are also like a very young couple, very immature, but they have their heart in the right place. Along with that, you have Sir James and Celia. So when Sir James was rejected by Dorothea, he ended up going with her sister. And this seems to be a much better fit for both of them. But there's still that question, if you were turned down by a girl and then you're courting her sister. She's going to be a part of your world. So what's going to happen to your love? Are you going to harbor some kind of jealousy or some kind of pain at being rejected by her? Or is your love going to transform into something else? So those are really kind of our four couples that we kind of need to keep in mind. We have Dorothea and Casaubon. We have Rosamond and Lydgate. We have Mary and Fred. And then we have Celia and Sir James. And so now as we move into book 3, I have a nice little list here where I see that we're pretty much just developing 3 parallel stories during this time. So Sir James and Celia, they're not really a core storyline in book 3, but they do serve as a reflective couple for Dorothea's relationship with Casaubon. So we do see here that there are certain things that Eliot tells us through other people. And that's something that, like, I think is a big theme in her storytelling that we see happening here, is that it would be very easy to tell Dorothea's story through Dorothea, or it'd be very easy to tell the story of Rosalind and Lydgate purely through their narration. But especially in the case of Dorothea and Casaubon, where so much is kind of unsaid, because they have difficulties communicating to each other. I think it's interesting that Eliot, as a narrative technique, has used gossip around the town and people commenting on relationships as ways of revealing things inside of that relationship. So she has a very indirect approach that she's very skilled at implementing in her narrative. So keep your eye out on that. I'll come back to that in a little bit. But first, I want to start where book 3 begins, and that's with Fred and Mary. So Fred and Mary, like I said earlier, they're very immature, but it's kind of developmentally appropriate. They're immature, but they're young, so you expect that. Fred has a problem with gambling, and he's trying to get some money back, and he thinks he can do it by buying and selling a horse. And so he wants to do this quick flip, but in order to get the initial cash to make this happen, he needs to borrow it. And he's confident that he can get the horse and he can turn it around for a profit and get the money back. And so who does he go to ask for money from? Well, he goes to his hopefully future father-in-law, Caleb Garth. And so he goes to Mary's dad. And Caleb, for all the things that he's interested in, like, he talks about, the narrator mentions that he knows about business, politics, preaching, learning, and amusement. But he never really had any close contact with business. He was always viewing it kind of as the outside, and he just didn't understand what business was, how it worked. And he's just a good salt of the earth guy, and he looks at Fred and thinks that he's a good, honest guy. And for that matter, Fred is honest. He's just dumb. Or he is honest, but he doesn't have the full picture of things. Again, he's honest, but he's young. And so you should only trust him so much. But Caleb sees it as initiative, and he sees it as goodwill. And so he trusts Fred with this money. He co-signs on a loan so that Fred can get the horse and do the horse trading. But it turns out that the horse is lame. He can't sell it. And he also can't pay for the debt. So this falls back on his hopefully future father-in-law, Caleb. And this is terrible because Fred has not only, you know, defaulted on a loan, which is bad enough, but he did it and conceivably doomed his prospect of being a part of the Garth family. But he also, uh, he- he's indebted to them. So he's kind of stuck with them even still. And so if it was just a stranger, you can be indebted to someone and we can have some kind of working agreement. You're still like in the hook. You still have to relate to them and repay them and such. But if you also need to be indebted to someone, but you ruined your prospects of being a part of that family and being with that woman you love, that's just like the worst scenario for him because you get all the commitment, but none of the joy, none of the benefit, none of the family. Um, and so that's kind of the prospect for Fred right now. And that's a painful place for him to be at. Um, as for the parents, how do they look at this? Again, you have Mrs. Garth, who is a very great self-educator, very great homeschool mom, who can just recite and correct things on grammar while, cooking and making bread, without batting an eyelash. And she is not very pro Fred. And then Mr. Garth, as we saw, he is pro Fred. Um, but he might be just as naive as Fred. Now, where does Mary fall in this? Well, she kind of takes after both of her parents. Um, she she loves Fred. She really does. But she also is very frustrated by him and wants him to grow up and is obviously very frustrated at how he's put her family in debt for his stupid plans. Um, but so that puts a little bit of a complication inside of Mary's story where she's not purely like her mom. And she has this affection for Fred just as her dad does. Um, here's a quote that Eliot talks about. There is often something maternal, even in a girlish love, and Mary's hard experience had wrought her nature to an impressibility very different from that hard slight thing which we call girlishness. At Fred's last words, she felt an instantaneous pang, something like what a mother feels at the imagined sobs or cry of her naughty, truant child, which may lose itself and get harm. And when, looking up, her eyes met his dull, despairing glance, her pity for him surmounted her anger and all of her anxieties. So it's ironic here that she takes after her mother in wanting to chastise and scold and, shame Fred. But then she also has what Eliot calls here a maternal love um, that looks at him as a naughty child who needs to be comforted because he didn't know what he was doing. So that's kind of the love that we see with her. She's willing to, they're kind of like stuck in this situation anyway. And it's really beautiful to see how these seemingly kind of minor characters are really manifesting this maturity arc where they start as very immature people who are stuck in a situation based on this debt and try and make the best of it. Well, if we're going to be stuck to each other and indebted with each other, why not manifest the maternal love? Why not love each other where we are? So I'm really impressed with what initially I thought were rather minor characters, but they are one of my favorite couples. To just kind of finish how that narrative arc goes in book 3, um, it turns out that Fred Vincy had something like an uncle. Old Featherstone is his name. He was his mom's sister-in-law's brother, something like that. Mom's brother-in-law. I don't really know how that works. I could look it up again. But regardless, he's childless. He's a bit of a miser. Um, and Fred is an heir of his. That being said, he also has an illegitimate son named Mr. Rigg, who rolls into town right as he is dying. And it turns out that old Featherstone has two wills. And there's this really great tense scene where Mary was hired to be the nurse to watch old Featherstone and keep vigil over him, as he's starting to go. And in the middle of the night, it talks about how the light from the fireplace is being cast all around. And it's a really great sense of ambience that she gives there, ambience and tension. And so old Featherstone, he kind of like wakes up with a jerk and he says to her, I have two wills. I need you to burn one of them. And so he had one will that was going to give everything to his illegitimate son, Mr. Rigg. And that was the second will, the one that he had done later. And then the prior will, the first will, would have left Fred Vincy 10,000 pounds. So a hefty fortune that would have totally changed Fred's life. It would more than pay for the horse debt and restore him to the good graces with the Garths. But Mary doesn't know what to do in this situation, and she's just kind of frozen. And it's hard for me to remember. I need to dig back in on this one. So maybe you can let me know what you thought about this. But there was a moral dilemma that I felt here that I thought would be really great for like an ethics philosophy course, to just take this little scene. A guy wakes up in the middle of the night who has a relationship to, this guy who is now ruining your family, but you love him. And he says, I need you to burn one of my wills. I don't remember if he really pointed out to Mary which one or which one would benefit, or if he just said, like, I need you to trust me, just do this. And she just froze and she didn't want to do it. I don't know if she did it out of principle. I didn't know if she did it out of fear. I don't know if she knows why she did what she did. But it turns out she does not burn the will that he asked her to burn. Maybe she thought it would ruin Fred because the other will would get something, would take the money elsewhere. Maybe she thought, if I tamper with the will, then they'll know that I did it, and then Fred isn't going to get it anyway. But it was just a really great moment of moral tension that I honestly it was such a page turner for me, and that's why I'm a little fuzzy on the details, but I definitely remember how it made me feel. But so we'll catch up with what happened to them in book 4 after I talk about the other two threads that we're talking about in here. But I'll pause once again to just, welcome anyone who joined. We're talking about books 3 and 4 inside of Middlemarch today. I have I have a previous lecture and a few essays that cover the introduction part. So you can get caught up on those if you like what you're hearing. And then I'll have some more essays that kind of unpack the things that I'm talking about tonight for you later on. Additionally, I should say, tell me, where are you from? Where do you live? How are you enjoying this book so far? Have you picked it up? Are you thinking of picking it up? Tell me what you had for lunch today. I don't care. Just leave me a comment, give me some feedback. And I'm glad that you're joining me tonight as I talk through this. So now let's move on to the Rosalind and Lydgate kind of thread. So there's not a whole lot to say here. It's kind of rather straightforward. Essentially, they're their storyline for book 3 is Rosamund and Lydgate. They're flirting, and eventually they get engaged. So it doesn't seem like there's much to say. However, I really appreciated Eliot's writing, particularly in the narration. I mean, their conversations and how they flirt back and forth with each other is pretty great. Like Rosamund is so well schooled and in, literature and stories and, pleasant things like this. And so she's trying to talk to Lydgate about that. And he says, oh, well, I read enough as a boy to keep me busy. Or he calls himself like, I'm a bear and I'm talking to you as a bird. There's some charming kind of flirts that they have back and forth. But I find where this really shines is in the narration. And so their story opens up with this beautiful quote that I'm just going to read verbatim for you because it's one of my favorite images in the book. An eminent philosopher among my friends who can dignify even your ugly furniture by lifting it into the serene light of science has shown me this pregnant little fact. Your pier glass or extensive surface of polished steel, made to be rubbed by a housemaid, will be minutely and multitudinously scratched in all directions. Place now against it a lighted candle as a center of illumination, and lo, the scratches will seem to arrange themselves in a fine series of concentric circles around that little sun. It is demonstrable that the scratches are going everywhere impartially, and it is only your candle which produces the flattering illusion of a concentric arrangement, its light falling with a exclusive optical selection. These things are a parable, the scratches are events, and the candle is the egoism of any person now absent, of Miss Vincy, for example. So here, I love this image that, if you polish your glasses and whatnot, there are really just very, very minute scratches that are going this way and that way randomly from the cloth. And it's these millions of little scratches that would look like nonsense if you just looked at them. But when you put like a light behind them, suddenly they're arrayed because of the light informing them and giving it order, where there really isn't any. And applying this to Rosamund, which is interesting, because in my couples matrix, I said that both Rosamund and Lydgate strike me as rather mature men and women. I didn't say that either of them was perfect. I could see that she had some ambitious things, and he had some hesitancy, or um, he was a withdrawn kind of person, So like no one's perfect. But now this idea of her egoism and how it informs things, it allows us to see that maybe Rosamund doesn't know why she does the things that she does. Maybe she's not really paying attention to the real world. Maybe she's allowing everything because she is so charismatic and everyone believes the story that she presents to everyone else. She's beautiful, she's graceful, she's charming. Everyone believes the story that she's telling, including herself. Maybe that means that she's not paying attention to reality and what's really going on here. Meanwhile, I would say that Lydgate, he's a very scientific guy, but he's also very cautious about romantic relationships after the woman he loved killed her husband on stage. And he was like, things can get kind of dicey here. So he doesn't have, the same kind of magnetic, charismatic kind of thing. If anything, he's a little bit withdrawn from the world, whereas she wants the whole world to kind of arrange itself around her. And usually the world is more than willing to do that for her because they find her so charming. But as the story goes on, you see the narrator just really talk about, you get a texture for flirting and what it is. Like, in fact, they flirted, and Lydgate was secure in the belief that they did nothing else. If a man could not love and be wise, surely he could flirt and be wise at the same time, no? Um, People could talk about the weather and other well-bred topics, but this seems like a hollow device, and behavior can hardly become easy unless it frankly recognizes a mutual fascination, which of course need not mean anything deep or serious. So here you can kind of see those scratches again. Kind of butchered that quote and tried to paraphrase it, but you can see here that, you know, flirting is kind of a superficial kind of thing, and that's where Rosamond really thrives. She's really charismatic and she can deal very well in the pleasant superficial things. Lydgate, he's attracted to flirting, and he's a handsome guy, and he's a good-hearted, fella, and so he kind of like gets drawn into it. But um yeah, to Rosamond, she she loves the thrill of the hunt. I think she loves the flirting. She loves the attention of a man like him, a good man like him. um and then it says to her they're as good as engaged, and sure enough they do get engaged later on. So that's kind of their thread, and a few things to pay attention to with them. Um, Now, as we move into like Dorothea and Casaubon, let's see here. I had some good notes on this one because it is just it. This is some of my favorite stuff. Again, the narrator needs to do a lot of work with Dorothea, because Dorothea is not very good at communicating with her husband. But the narrator is very much up to the task. When we were in Rome, we heard a lot about, the city, and how Rosamond was, finding herself in this romantic city and seeing all of life paraded around her. But we also got a sense of this kind of deep loneliness, even being surrounded by so many beautiful churches and beautiful statues and beautiful art. She was surrounded by beauty, and yet she was married to a man that doesn't really have much affection or love for her. He has about as much as he can give, but that's just because he has a paucity of love himself. He doesn't know how to love, and so she shouldn't be surprised that he doesn't know how to love her. Um, and so, again, the narrator, because these people are not having very good conversations, we saw the narrator kind of talk about what they were thinking in their heads about each other. So we heard what was said between them, but really we heard what was felt and thought between them. And the narrator kind of continues this this task, this trend, as they come home from their honeymoon. So they came back from a very not very romantic honeymoon in Rome, and then they come home to their house, and the furniture shrinking becomes such a recurrent image throughout the text that is just like a fugue that Eliot does for us. And I'll read a few of these sections, but the furniture shrinking, did anyone else recognize that, or like remember that, or feel that when you were reading this section? And for those of you that haven't, here's a few to give you a taste. The very furniture in the room seems to have shrunk since she saw it before. The stag in the tapestry looked more like a ghost in his ghostly blue-green world. The volumes of polite literature in the bookcase looked more like a movable imitation of books. The bright fire of dry oak boughs burned on the logs, seemed an incongruous renewal of life and glow, like the figure of Dorothea herself, as she entered carrying the red leather cases containing cameos for Celia. The duties of her married life, contemplated as so great before, seemed to be shrinking with the furniture and the white vapor-walled landscape. The clear heights where she expected to walk in full communion had become difficult to see even in her imagination. The delicious repose of the soul on a complete superior had been shaken into uneasy effort and alarmed with dim presentiment. When would the days begin of that active wifely devotion which was to strengthen her husband's life and exalt her own? Never, perhaps, as she had preconceived them. But somehow still, in this solemnly pledged union of her life, duty would present itself in new form of inspiration and give new meaning to wifely love. That had been her brief history since she had left off learning morning lessons and practicing silly rhythms on the hated piano. Marriage, which was to bring guidance into worthy and imperative occupation, had not yet freed her from the gentlewoman's oppressive liberty. It had not even filled her leisure with the ruminant of joy of unchecked tenderness. Her blooming, full-pulsed youth stood there in moral imprisonment, which made itself one with the chill, colorless, narrowed landscape, with the shrunken furniture, the never-read books, and the ghostly stag in a pale, fantastic world that seemed to be vanishing from the daylight. So she goes on and she really riffs on this, even further than what I did. But this sense of everything shrinking around her and then vanishing away from her, her ideas about what marriage was, that lofty communion, that active wifely love that she was hoping for. She didn't even know what it would look like, but from what she's seen, it's not anything like what she thought it might reveal itself to be. Now, and I think that we can all sympathize with her and what's happening, because she did enter into an ill-advised marriage. No one really stopped her. And it was, I mean, yeah, that's how I expected her to come home from her honeymoon with Casaubon. And she's becoming more lonely. But one thing I want to point out that happened in there was a question was raised. When would the days begin of that active wifely devotion which was to strengthen her husband's life and exalt her own? So a question is raised. When is she going to get that life that will benefit Casaubon and will benefit her? She hasn't given up hope on it, and I think that's an important thing. Yes, she is experiencing her ideals failing her. She's experiencing marriage not turning out to be what she expected, but she hasn't given up hope somehow. And she still says, like in this last line here, in this solemnly pledged union of her life, duty would present itself in some new form of inspiration and give a new meaning to wifely love. So that confirms the hope that we could intuit in the previous line. She is willing to commit herself to her wifely duties. She's willing to blindly trust the duties. She doesn't have the experience, which is revealing to her what it will mean for her to be a wife to Casaubon. But she, in place of hope, she will follow through on duty. And I think, for a lot of us that saw, Will Ladislaw introduced before, we modern people are definitely like, dump the old fart you should have never married and run off with this like romantic guy and experience the world. That's what everyone wants this to be, Anna Karenina. We want her to be Anna, and we want Ladislaw to be Vronsky, and we want life to be great and romantic and for there to be no consequences. But that's not what she is doing here. She's open to duty more than we are, I think, most of us. She knows that she signed up for a terrible marriage. She knows she was wrong for doing it, but she honors the commitment that she made and she's willing to follow through on it. So she's a very admirable character, um, while also being a very sympathetic character. You can feel for her and understand her pain and how she went wrong, but you don't abandon her, just as she hasn't abandoned her own duty to this man. So I think it's a very complex relationship that they have here, and a very impressive one. Um, Not a perfect one, as we'll see. Um, but at this point, at the end of book three, it's still very admirable. Um, so I'll just pause there before moving into the stuff on book four. Does anyone have any questions on Middlemarch? Anyone have any questions on other books that I'm reading? My Northern Michigan vacation, which I was teasing, I should have been totally on vacation, but the water is so beautiful, and the woods were so great, and it was just so relaxing. I had to share a little bit of my vacation with you. Um, Likewise, as I mentioned at the beginning of this live lecture, if you're in the Grand Rapids area, particularly, but if you're in Michigan or the Great Lakes area, more generally, I'm going to be hosting a series of meetups here in Grand Rapids for Substackers. So if you're within a car drive away, um, I'll be posting about those, and I'd love for you to come to a meet and greet, and we can talk with other Substackers in the area, and kind of talk about what we want this conference to be, um, in next year. So I said if my post got a bunch of likes and restacks that I would put together a conference up here, and lo and behold, it overperformed what I thought it would. So um, if you want to come to Michigan and hang out with us, you'll see more details about that coming up. So, but otherwise, just tell me how your day was. What are you reading? Anything good? Be it a book or other substackers I should check out. Um, join join the conversation. Be a part of that. I can see that people are joining, but I haven't seen any comments come in. So let me just know that the chat function is working, because sometimes it has not worked, and people were sending in questions and I didn't know. So if that's the case, feel free to DM me or something like that, so I know. Um, Substack's a new platform and it's not always perfect. All right. So let me get my notes here for book four, kind of queued up. There we go. All right. So what I want to do here, like, book four is interesting because, to give you like a general overview on it, in books one and two, we were introduced to Dorothea and the other characters, and kind of we had some ground set. We had the initial conflict of her marriage. Other kind of seeds of conflict were kind of scattered. But then we kind of mature a little bit in book three, where Eliot allows these three relationships to kind of develop and mature a little bit. In book four, there isn't a whole lot of like resolution or things that you didn't get in book 3. So this will be kind of like a quick recap on book 4, because book 3 has the bulk of these storylines. And then what largely happens in book 4 is a few new surprises get introduced. And some of these surprises and these upsetting things are going to then be resolved in books 5 and 6, which we'll talk about next month. So, for instance, let's pick up where we left off with Dorothea and Casaubon. Now, Dorothea, obviously, I've hammered this point home. She's in a marriage I would not advise someone to enter into. And then Casaubon has the cousin Will, who has taken a shining to Dorothea, and Dorothea has an affinity with him as well, where they can talk about things. They feel very comfortable with each other, and I mean, they're family now. They're cousins with each other in a way, and so there's this proximity. But again, he's the more eligible bachelor for her. He's the better romantic fit for her, and Casaubon knows this. We can see that kind of the tension is ramping up between their marriage, where instead of it, tensions in a marriage can only exist in your head for so long. If you live with someone every single day, these things are going to come out. It might take weeks, it might take months, it might take years even, but these things will come out when you're with these people or when you're with another person like that. And so we see kind of some tensions with them. I want to call out this line I really liked, where Casaubon was. I guess I did kind of skip over kind of an important part in book 3, but yeah. So Casaubon is referred to as like a fly that's born in a swamp, and he dreams of like he's too busy thinking of his own wings without ever flying. So he has like a very sympathetic conversation, or a very sympathetic and pitiable kind of persona that's painted of him in the story. And Casaubon and Dorothea get into an argument, thankfully. Again, I think arguments are healthy. It means that finally some things are coming out. The problem is that Casaubon is a 45-year-old man, and in that time, being 45 was not, you're not as healthy as you might be in 2026. And so they have this argument, and then he has a heart attack. And again, as I noted earlier, Sir James talks about how noble and faithful Dorothea's love is for Casaubon, and how she hasn't abandoned, her husband, who now, they don't know if he has 15 minutes to live or if he has 15 years to live. I mean, it's closer to 15 minutes. They all know that, but they still tell him 15 years to keep his hopes up. And so I think it's interesting, how Eliot tells us what Sir James thinks about Dorothea. Again, Dorothea turned down Sir James. And so it would be easy for him to, maybe be a little bit sour that, he didn't choose her, and instead she chose this old, dusty academic guy. But again, there's that element of sympathy and that indirect storytelling that Eliot uses here. And she uses conversations with Sir James to note, how other people look in on this situation, that she doesn't just tell us from the perspective of the people that are involved in that relationship, but points out how he sees a nobility to her willing to suffer and be with this old guy. But meanwhile, the narrator slyly includes that Sir James might not know how much penitence was in that love, because again, she had the argument with him that kind of caused his heart attack to happen. He was, agitated, and so she feels a little bit guilty about that, and so maybe her guilt is one reason why she hasn't, um, cut off herself from him. Or it could be that, she, it could be duty, as we mentioned earlier, but she does not give up on her husband. Um, Meanwhile, Will rolls back into town in book 4. And so when he comes in, he gets involved with a paper called The Pioneer, and he is a young romantic guy, and he gets very swept up in politics, and the reform bill and movements are happening at this time. He wants to be involved with that. And so he gets into this, political magazine and endorsing candidates and trying to stir up interest in political issues in a small town. And so his insertion into this relationship, again, he is family. He's Casaubon's cousin. And so it's natural that he would be included in these kinds of, conversations and this kind of familiarity with them. But Casaubon, is kind of on death's door. There's not that much to talk about with him. Dorothea finds herself talking with Will a lot. Casaubon can tell that he's kind of running up on the end of his days, and he wants Dorothea to kind of like continue his work, and so he's in this desperate hurt kind of spot as his young cousin and romantic rival is entering into his life and maybe sweeping his wife off her feet. And so it just says that where their story leaves off is that she holds his hand tenderly after another episode, and she's a faithful wife. But Casaubon wants to make it impossible for Dorothea and Will to marry after his death. And so there's kind of like a selflessness on her part that she's willing to just be there for her husband, and her husband is just so bitter and resentful and jealous of Will that he wants to make sure that they can't get together even after he dies. So that's how their story ends on book 4. And then that's where we leave off, and we're going to pick back up next month. What are they going to do with that? Another thread that we can pick up on is that Mr. Brooke is kind of being courted and brought into the political conversation through Will. And Mr. Brooke, again, he's a good-natured guy, but he's not always, he's not the sharpest either. He's a very avuncular uncle, if you will. He's a good uncle character, but he's not very direct. He's not very charismatic, all of this kind of stuff. And I want to comment on something that was mentioned where you have these epigraphs in there, and a lot of people don't necessarily know, what do you do with these epigraphs? What do the quotes from Milton and Quixote and, you know, and Shakespeare, you can spend one reading of Middlemarch just asking, how does the epigraph tie to what happens inside of that particular chapter? Um, and there was one that I found really interesting, particularly if you're interested in philosophy, was there was a Pascal quote. Um, I think it was chapter 30 or so. And the Pascal quote essentially says something like, if you come to the point where like you need to let go, then let go. And um, inside of there, she says that Mr. Brooke is writing a letter, and he mentions that he apologizes for having to write a long letter um, because he had difficult writing a shorter one. And this is a quote that she's kind of paraphrasing from Pascal, which was, if I would have had more time, I would have written you a shorter letter. Another Pascal quote that she works in there is she talks about Mr. Brooks' pen, and she calls it a thinking organ, and talks about, all the kind of melodies and whatnot that the pen is writing. And this is also something that you find in Pascal's Pensées, that he talks about man as a thinking reed, but he also talks about man as a thinking organ upon which the world plays and upon which we play. Um, so I I don't know all of the connections between the epigrams and the things that are inside of there, but that was one that I did know. So Pascal fans rejoice. There's one in there. And those are very fun images. So if you found any more connections between the epigraphs and what is mentioned inside the chapter, feel free to throw them my way, because there's an interesting bit of archaeology you can do on there. Um, Now I'm going to go and we'll talk about Rosalind and Lydgate for a little bit. And here's yet another beautiful image. It seems like she really loves to break these out in Rosamond and Lydgate's relationship. But it says, young lovemaking, that gossamer web, even the points it clings to, the things whence its subtle interlacings are swung, are scarcely perceptible. Momentary touches of fingertips, meetings of rays from blue and dark orbs, unfinished phrases, lightest changes of cheek and lip, faintest tremors. The web itself is made of spontaneous beliefs and indefinable joys, yearnings of one's life towards another, visions of completeness, indefinite trust. And Lydgate fell to spinning that web from his inward self with a wonderful rapidity, in spite of experience, supposed to be finished off with the drama of Laure. So Laure was the French woman from before. So it's interesting that, I kind of went on a little bit earlier about the lens image, the pier glass image, where Rosalind, had, she's like this light. Her ego is like a light that takes all the randomness and kind of like orders it into like these holes. But then she or Eliot, to be specific, applies the same kind of analogy in a different way with the web, and how this web has like this spontaneous connection, connecting all things really effortlessly and subtly, and how now it's not Rosamond that is, the light making all of this stuff connected, but now it's Lydgate who's spinning this web and finding himself, engaged to Rosamond. And so I think that's just like amazing that they have these two very well developed parallel images that she ties in there. And so the main thing that is going on with Lydgate and Lydgate and Rosamond is that he came in here to be, kind of building up medicine and, kind of stirring the pot. And he had like these kind of ambitions. I mean, he just wanted to do medicine well, but when everyone else wants a status quo, um, he seems to be the ambitious one and the social climber or the something like this. And Rosamond is attracted to that because she is very socially ambitious herself. And so that's part of the reason why she gets um, engaged to him. Now, the problem with this is that he doesn't have a lot of money and she doesn't have a lot of money either. And so it's tough when you have someone who is very ambitious, but you don't give her the resources to live out that ambition. So that's kind of like the pin that I want to put there. And we're going to check back up next month to see how does she do with this, how is her personality and how is her relationship going to change now that circumstances are different? They're not what she expected and they're very real. It's just like Dorothea. Dorothea had these ideals about what she wanted marriage to be and learning and all of this stuff. And then it turned out that marriage is different. So now we have Rosamond and Lydgate who are going to get married, and it's not an ideal situation. So we're going to see how their ideals confront with reality when we pick back up with them later. Now the thing, let's see here. I want to make sure that I'm not jumping ahead too much for next month, but yeah, I don't think so. Yeah. So, as I mentioned, Mr. Brooke, he's not really like a main character with like a lot of things that are going on, but he is a connective character. And I mentioned that he gets involved with Will in politics because he had nothing better to do, I guess. And he's got this estate to manage. Dorothea is marrying Casaubon, and then Celia is going off with Sir James. He needs some help around the estate, and Mr. Brooke hires Caleb Garth to do that, and he'll be the groundskeeper, which is great because, as we mentioned at the beginning of this sequence, Caleb Garth is impoverished because he co-signed on a loan with Fred, his almost future son-in-law. And so this allows them to play catch up on their finances after that unfortunate business of loaning out the money for the horse and not getting the money back. And so with him becoming the groundskeeper, their fortunes are kind of turning around. That takes a little bit of the pressure off of the Fred and Mary relationship. And also between Fred and his future father-in-law, or potentially future father-in-law, Mr. Garth or Caleb Garth, who again has an affinity for Fred. He doesn't hate him. He's not mad at him. He understands that he's just as responsible for lending the money as Fred is for losing it. So we're kind of like set up also with him becoming the groundskeeper, him getting a new foothold, and maybe him needing some help. And maybe Fred can help him on the grounds as well. So I'm putting a pin in that one, and we can pick their conversation up next month as well. And then there's one last thing that I have to mention, and that's, I've already started to mention this a little bit, but we had Mr. Riggs who showed up, and I already mentioned that he's an illegitimate son. And then we also have Mr. Raffles, who we don't really know his whole story, but he's drunk oftentimes and he's making scenes and he's really getting under Bulstrode's, under putting a bee in Bulstrode's bonnet. And so we think that maybe Mr. Bulstrode, who has a very good reputation as a strong evangelical Christian and a shrewd businessman, why is he so put out by this drunk guy who's showing up? And I'm not going to say too much about that either, because that's really a question that gets fleshed out in the next book or two. So I'll save that. But yes, Raffles is introduced and Riggs is introduced and Bulstrode's kind of storyline is kind of brought back in, and we're going to pay more attention to it. But for books 2 and 4 that we've covered today, I think it's mostly those 3 storylines that are being developed, where you have the Fred and Mary story, where we start with the horse, the debt, and then we end with the losing of the will, where Fred could have been spared if Mary would have burned the will, but she didn't, and it was just a really morally unfortunate situation there. But Mr. Garth is becoming the land manager here, and it seems like there might be more to that story as we continue. We have Rosamond and Lydgate, and pretty much they were flirting, they were engaged, and they're going to be married with no money. How are their egos and their lens and their web images, how are those going to be affected once we get into a real marriage and real life? And then, of course, we have Dorothea and Casaubon, who are coming back into their real life. But it seems that Casaubon is not here for long in this life. And it seems that his cousin Will is inserting himself into this conversation and what's going to happen between Dorothea and Will once Casaubon passes away. And also, what kind of wife is she going to be up until the end of that? So those are my 3 main storylines that I'm keeping in mind for books 3 and 4 that we covered today. I hope boiling it down to just 3 storylines helps simplify it for you. But yeah, feel free to ask me any other questions that you have. Reach out with any comments. Tell me, what are you thinking about this book? What are you thinking of Middlemarch? And what do you want to read next? So, speaking of which, I have the 2 books that I'll tease for what we're going to do after we finish Middlemarch. Now, first of all, if you are new to Armchair Notes and you're just like getting started with us, we're just in the middle of this book right now, and do not be intimidated by it. It is like 800 pages, depending on your edition. But they're very short chapters. They're pretty quick to read. There's it's very eloquent prose. It flows really well, I find, very natural between the narrator's voice and each person in the small town. And so if you love conversations, if you've lived in a small town and you see how people bicker back and forth, or how people gossip about one another, I mean, the story is told largely through those 2 modes. So it's very familiar to me. I grew up in a small town. But I think it would be very familiar and digestible for a lot of people. And And additionally, there's lots of really good philosophical ideas. There's lots of little aphorisms that she scatters through without. There's, as I mentioned here, several really great images about the shrinking furniture, about the lens, about the web. Um, and all of those are just really great to just sit with and reread. And they get better, like even when I reread them here. Um, so we're going to be doing the next two books. So that'll be 5 and 6 next month in September. It'll be the last Wednesday in September. And then we'll do the final book 7 and 8 after that. So that should give you plenty of time, even if you're just picking it up. I've been taking this as a very leisurely read. It's been very good during the summer. And yeah, I'm taking our time so that we can really enjoy what she's talking about, get to know these characters. I was leading a book club with a couple of guys on Monday, and we were talking that it's like a Netflix series or something. Reading these episodes, very snackable, very bingeable. So don't be intimidated by Middlemarch. It might be your next book, or I hope it is, because it's what we're currently reading. So, or whenever you get around to it, these lectures and these essays will be here for you. So then after that, we're going to do a short book, Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis. This is one of my desert island books. I love it. There's no talking badgers or Santa Claus or talking lions or anything like that. It's just, although there is a guy named the Fox, but that's a different story. This is just a really stunning book that will kind of, we're kind of going to go from, Dorothea, who's a woman in a bad marriage, and she feels, this alone or this solitude, and what does she do with it? A kind of similar thing is put on Oriol here in this story, where she is isolated when she loses her sister, and she's mad at the gods for taking her. But we'll see how maybe her reaction differs from that of Dorothea. And then finally, in December, we're going to cover one of my favorite books of all time. I practically have the thing memorized at this point, but it's Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. And he will be the 100th year anniversary of his death is this December. And so I think if you've been dead for 100 years and people are still reading your works, that's what makes you count as a classic. And so I thought it would be a perfect time, with his anniversary, to read Rilke. And these are super short. You can read them in an afternoon in a sitting. And it won't be too strenuous during the holidays and Christmas readings and stuff like that. But it will, these are game changer essays or letters rather. And you don't forget what these do to you. So if you're a creative person, or you want to be a little bit more creative, or you want to look at the world a little bit more creatively, Letters to a Young Poet is really the best. And I'm not going to give away too much more, but my theme for this year was kind of looking at freedom, but my theme for next year is really going to be more about creativity. And so the books that we're reading next year are all going to have to do with creativity. And so he's kind of our bridge into next year. So I'm excited to share what the book club, the reading, my essays, some other things are going to be for next year. But just for the time being, get yourself a copy of Rilke and enjoy these. So feel free to ask me, any other questions on that. But that should give you a sense of what we're doing with the rest of the year, and maybe kind of set up what we're going to do in next year. But in any case, thanks for joining me talking about books 3 and 4 about Middlemarch. It's been really great to read this during the summer and to get to chat about it and see some of your comments on the posts and things like that. So if you're new to Armchair Notes, like just make your way through some old posts and find a way to put yourself into the conversation. One final thing is that I have my last Dostoevsky essay that is going to come out in the next week or so. And then that is going to wrap up the Brothers Karamazov. So that's all here, all drafted up. And now I just need to put it in form and publish it for you. So that is the final installment of the Brothers Karamazov. And I wanted to be done with it